just fed up and frustrated with the lack of response he received from the Western rulers to try to go and reconquer the city of Constantinople. In 1464 then, he actually publicly took the cross and took the vow to go on crusade, and then began to assemble an army in port in Italy, and then made his way down to the port. Unfortunately, while he was there, disease broke out in port, he contracted it and died. And so his crusade came to nothing. As a result, the rest of the army just went back to their homes. So we have just here in the example of Pius II, a clear indication of what we talked about at the end of Boniface VIII's pontificate, that the Western rulers, the kings of France and of England, of the Holy Roman Emperor, are no longer listening to the Pope. And that is going to, again, cause a problem when we come into our next time period of protesters and defenders. And again, we just have another data point, another example of the Pope calling Western rulers to account, asking them to go do something for the church and for the papacy, and again, they don't respond. Now, as a result, during this period of time, we've been talking about weak leaders, and we've mentioned some of them by name, but we also have what's known in history as the Renaissance popes. This is the period of time of the Renaissance popes, and actually they're in this time period and our next time period. And if you look on your epic chart, you can identify. I'll show you how you can identify the Renaissance popes on your chart. If you look on your epic chart in the time period of weak leaders and schism, if you look at number 209, Nicholas V. Nicholas V is considered the first Renaissance pope. And so from Nicholas V all the way to the next time period of protesters and defenders, to Leo X, number 218, those are the 10 Renaissance popes. So we have them all listed for you, from Nicholas V all the way down to Leo X. And again, the issue with the Renaissance popes is that they really embodied the whole notion of weak leadership. These were men who were more concerned with being secular princes than they were with being the universal shepherd of the church, really exercising the role that they have been called to by God to be the Holy Father. Many of them also participated in ecclesiastical abuses that were rampant during this period of time in church history. The abuse, for example, of simony. The simony, as we mentioned before, is the buying and selling of ecclesiastical offices. So many of them, bought bishoprics or had family members who bought bishoprics, and there's even some concern or some evidence that maybe one of these popes actually bought the papacy. So we have some serious abuse going on during this period of church history. We also have them engaging in nepotism, appointing their nephews and their cousins and their uncles and brothers into high important positions of the church. Not appointing them because they were men of good learning or good leaders or worthy of the office, but simply because they were related to them in order to have their family consolidate power over the church. They were driven more by their family concerns than by the concerns of the church. They also engaged in the sin of pluralism, which is holding more than one diocese. And again, remember that during this time, land is wealth. Land equates to great revenue. So if you have more than one diocese, then you can receive the revenue from more and more land. And so we'll see this come into play too with our Renaissance popes. Again, they saw themselves more as secular princes than as the shepherd of the Church of Christ. Now, perhaps the poster child of these Renaissance popes is a man by the name of Rodrigo Borgia, who was a Spaniard who took the name when he became Pope, Alexander VI. And Alexander VI reigned from 1492 to 1503. He was guilty of that ecclesiastical abuse of simony, or of pluralism rather, that I talked about. He actually held 5 wealthy dioceses at one time. He was a personally charming man and a very shrewd politician. Now, when he became Pope, it said that he exclaimed, "I am Pope! I am Pope!" He was excited to be Pope. Now, we all know that any man in their right mind would not want to be the Pope, would not want to have that authority and that responsibility placed upon them. And Benedict XVI, our current Holy Father, even before the conclave began, gave a homily which many interpreted to be, "Don't elect me Pope." But he didn't want that responsibility. But when given the chance, or shown God's plan for him, that he was elected and called to be the successor to St. Peter, Benedict, obviously Joseph Ratzinger, then took that authority and took that position and took that plan that God had for him and agreed to it. So most good men who are elected to the chair of St. Peter are not going to exclaim in happiness that they are elected Pope, but Rodrigo Borgia did. Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici, who was in the conclave at the time when Rodrigo Borgia was elected Alexander VI, Giovanni de' Medici eventually would become Leo X, but when he found out that Rodrigo Borgia had been elected to the papacy, he said to others, he said, "Flee! We are in the clutches of the wolf." So he was known for not being perhaps the most saintly of men coming to this great office. We do know that Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, had illegitimate children while he was a cardinal, at least 7, with 2 different women. One of his illegitimate children was Caesar Borgia. And Caesar Borgia terrorized Italy. He went throughout all Italy with this ragtag group of mercenaries and an army, and just ransacked and ramaged and ravaged and pillaged and raped and all his way across Italy. And Niccolo Machiavelli actually went with Caesar Borgia, joined his army, and was with him as he went on some of his escapades. And some historians believe that Caesar Borgia was the example that Machiavelli used when he wrote The Prince. That the one who Machiavelli is describing as the perfect prince is Caesar Borgia, this illegitimate son of Alexander VI. Now we know, or it's possible rather, that Alexander VI also had a child while he was Pope. It's possible that he had an 8th child while he was Pope. We do know for a fact, though, that he had a 19-year-old mistress while he was Pope. So again, we just have to take time out and understand that while these men are engaged in these abuses and are not living up to the office of the Holy Father, in no way, shape, or form invalidates the institution of the papacy. We have to keep in mind that those who are called to even the highest offices in the church are human beings, fallen yet redeemed creatures. Sometimes they do not live up to the life that they are called to live. But that doesn't mean that there's something inherently wrong with the papacy or even something wrong with the Catholic Church. It's illustrative, though, of the larger context and culture that is going on now during this period of time. So we have Alexander VI as kind of the poster child of the Renaissance popes. We'll talk about 2 more Renaissance popes in our next time period of protesters and defenders when we look at Julius II and Leo X. But now we have to take time at the end of our time period here to look at the institution in Spain of the Inquisition. This is another major event that is usually talked about. There are certain ideas and myths that are associated with this institution, so we have to take time to look at the specific historical circumstances of it. Now, the situation in Spain during the 15th century is this: that Isabel of Spain marries Fernando of Aragon in 1469. Isabel of Castile marries Fernando of Aragon in 1469, and their marriage forms the Kingdom of Spain. And one of the things that they do is they embark on the finishing act of the Reconquista, of kicking the Muslims out of the Iberian Peninsula. That's finally accomplished during their reign in 1492, when the last Muslim stronghold in Granada falls. And eventually then Spain can declare victory in reconquering their country and liberating their country from Muslim influence. Now, it doesn't mean that Muslims didn't exist in Spain. There were Muslims who were still living in Spain during this time, although eventually they would be expelled from Spain. So the Inquisition was created in Spain to deal with a very particular situation that was only present in Spain. And the situation in Spain was this: was you had people in Spain who were Jews or Muslims who converted to the Christian Catholic faith, but they did so only publicly, meaning secretly they continued to practice to be Jews and they continued practicing being Muslims. They only converted in order to gain position in Spanish society or to hold certain jobs, because there were certain jobs and positions and other things that were closed in Spanish society to those who were not Catholic. And so we have these kind of false conversions, really. And these people are known as conversos in Spanish. So they actually did convert, they received baptism, but again, they're publicly living the faith, but privately they're living another faith, the Jewish or the Muslim faith. Now, many of these conversions, many people who were Jewish or Muslim who did convert, their conversions were authentic, and the Inquisition was not concerned with those. They were only concerned with those who publicly acted like a Catholic, but privately were something much different. Now, why this was a huge issue or problem in Spain is because the Spanish over the last 770 years have been fighting a war with Islam to try to reconquer their country. And so there was a great amount of concern in Spain over any latent Jewish or Muslim influence. It was a threat to national security almost, that any potential converso could become a traitor. You wouldn't know necessarily if this person was going to be loyal to the crown, was going to be loyal to the state. Any potential converso could open the doors or open the city gates to a Muslim army that had encamped outside of it. So it was a concern of national security for Isabel and Fernando to begin the Inquisition. You ultimately really had tens of thousands of people in Spain living false lives, living really a lie, pretending to be Christian but holding on to their old faith. Now, some of these people had actually risen to high and important positions in the government and even high positions of importance in the church. So this was a very serious problem for these monarchs to deal with. And we also know, too, that conversos, they were concerned, Isabel and Fernando were concerned that these conversos could actually even stir up rebellion in the realm. And again, keep the historical context in mind, that Spain had been fighting for centuries in order to unify and bring the country together. And now that it was unified, Fernando and Isabel wanted to ensure that the country remained united. So they created the Inquisition in order to preserve, with the church, to preserve national security and to promote spiritual and social unity in Spain. Now again, just like the medieval inquisitors, the Inquisition in Spain had no control over practicing Jews and Muslims. So if you were a practicing Jew and Muslim, you would not be brought before the Inquisition. It's only if you converted to the faith to be a Christian, but secretly you were still practicing Judaism or practicing Islam, would you then be liable to be brought before the Inquisition. Now one dark moment in the history of the Spanish Inquisition that we do have to talk about, that is really one of those events that, almost like the sack of Constantinople by the Crusaders, it cannot be justified, but it can be explained. And this is the decision by Fernando and Isabel in 1492 to expel all the Jews, the practicing Jews, from Spain. And this was a decision of the crown. They didn't come to this decision. This was not a decision by the church. It was a decision by the crown. It was a decision that they didn't come to easily. They believed that the presence of practicing Jews in the country had a negative effect on the conversos. Basically meaning that the conversos were being supported in living their secret lives as practicing Jews because of the presence of Jews in Spain. At least this was the idea, this was the thought. So the crown issued an edict expelling all Jews from Spain. The hope was that these Jews would convert to the faith and not actually leave the country, but many of them did leave. It's hard to come up with exact numbers of how many left and how many converted. All we know for certain is that at this time in Spain in 1492, there were about 80,000 Jews in the country. So it's a fairly large population that we're talking about dealing with here, and that had an effect on this imperial edict. So we have to mention that event, and it happens in the context of the Inquisition, but again, it was a decision of the crown, and it was done because of this fear that the practicing Jews would somehow influence or continue to support the conversos, those who had converted to the faith, but secretly were living as Jews. So the Inquisition was founded in Spain by Fernando and Isabel, again, to bring about social and spiritual unity in Spain and to deal with matters of national security. The Inquisition operated under very specific procedures, just like the medieval Inquisition. These procedures were drawn up by the Inquisitor General. The first set of instructions were actually written and issued in 1484 by the Inquisitor General Tomás de Torquemada. Now, the procedures that they followed were actually very similar to the procedures followed by the medieval inquisitors. There was a period of grace, a time of grace, when the inquisitors would come into a region, the tribunal would be established, and you would be allowed an opportunity to come in and confess that you were a converso, that you were a secretly practicing Jew or Muslim. You would be given then a suitable penance and then left to go. And this edict of grace, or this period of grace, could last anywhere from several weeks to several months. It varied depending upon the situation. After the period of grace was over, then there was a time of accusation where people could be accused of being a converso. Evidence was assembled against that individual. If it looked likely that the charges were accurate, then the suspected person would be arrested, and they would be jailed until their hearing was completed. Also, their property would be confiscated by the government. If they were acquitted and found that the charges were false, they'd be released from jail and their property would be returned to them. Also, though, what kind of a different situation in the Spanish Inquisition than from the medieval inquisitors is that those who were hauled before the Spanish Inquisition were allowed a defense lawyer, were allowed an advocate, somebody to advocate for them to say, no, this person is truly a practicing Catholic, is not a converso. So that was a little bit different. Torture was also authorized for use during the Spanish Inquisition, but like the time of the medieval inquisitors, it was something that was used only rarely and was used only as a last resort. So this whole image and myth that we have of the church torturing just for the sake of torturing all these individuals during this period of time, the Spanish Inquisition in the 13th century with the medieval inquisitors, is not accurate at all. Torture was actually used less frequently in the Spanish Inquisition than it was used in secular courts. Torture was used quite extensively in state courts and not so much in ecclesiastical courts like the Spanish Inquisition. All torture sessions were carefully and meticulously recorded. There are a lot of records from these trials during the Spanish Inquisition because records were meticulously kept and transcripts kept of what was said specifically. And again, torture was used always to elicit a confession to get information, never as a form of punishment. Now, once you had gone through the trial and you had been, maybe you converted, or during the trial you agreed that you were a heretic, or rather that you were a converso, that you were a secretly practicing Jew or Muslim, well, what happened is you would then be sentenced. And your sentence could either be issued privately or issued publicly. And this was different from the medieval inquisitors. In Spain, they had an actual public pronouncement of the penitential sentence for those who repudiated their life as a converso. And these public events were known as the auto de fe, or the act of faith. And they were very, very popular public events in Spain. They'd be led by these penitents would be led by a priest in procession up to the town square, and there would be this large and well-attended public act of repentance and a giving of the sentence, a giving of the penance. And these auto de fe's were used to really reinforce the social and spiritual unity of the Spanish people. It was, again, a very popular event that people attended, and it was something that helped bring people together in the communion of faith. Now, the possible verdicts that could be issued from the Inquisition: you could be acquitted of the charges, you could receive a punishment by penance, or if you persisted in your life as a converso and persisted in your heresy, then you would be turned over to the state for punishment. And the punishment, the secular punishment for living the life of a converso and for not being repentant of that life, was to be executed. Now again, let's look at some numbers and determine what is the actual numbers of people who were killed during the Spanish Inquisition. Does it meet up with what we commonly think of in our modern world, that the image has been presented to us? Between the years 1550 and 1800, so 1550 to 1800, over several centuries of the existence of the Spanish Inquisition, it's estimated by good historians using modern research that 3,000 people were killed during that period of time. That equates to 12 per year. So 3,000 people over the several centuries, 12 per year. Again, it doesn't mean that we just acknowledge that this is what happened historically, but we need to make sure that it does differ with what the modern myth presents of this period of time. So we have to know the historical context and have good data in order to answer the objections that people bring to us about this particular event in church history. In one particular city, the city of Valencia, from 1566 to 1609, so over a 43-year period of time, there were 62 people who were brought, or there were 3,000 cases, rather, that were brought before the Inquisition. So over 62 years in the city of Valencia, 3,000 cases were brought before the Inquisition. Of those 3,000 cases, 84% were given penances and reconciled to the church. 84% were given penances and reconciled to the church. Remember, the whole job of the Inquisition, the medieval inquisitors and the Spanish Inquisition, was to bring people back to the church, to bring people into living fully the life that they had embraced as baptized Christians, to agree and to follow the teachings of the church. 3% of the cases ended in the accused being absolved. 9% of the sentences were suspended. 4% of the cases resulted in death. that equates to 62 people over a 43-year period of time. So again, just, historical understanding